Pretty amazing background when it comes to art. You've traveled around the world and exhibited around the world as well. So we're really excited to talk to you today.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk to you as well.
And your show is beautiful. The thought process behind it is amazing. And so really excited to talk to you about this. Before we get into that, talk to us just a little bit about your background and what you do, because the work you do is mostly with clay, but not always in one form.
That's correct. So I first started working with clay when I was living in Japan. I was there for a period of 5 years in total. I first went there to teach English, and while I was there, I started working with a local ceramic artist who is a master potter. And I was initially working with him in a hobby student kind of capacity, and then immediately took to the material and really fell in love with it. I had studied art in undergrad as well, but had never worked with clay. And so during that period of time, my focus was pretty strictly on making functional ware and really developing the technique of producing really well-made, usable pottery. And then when I came back to the States, I was getting really interested in how I could return to some of the more conceptual inquiries that I had been exploring in undergrad. And so I applied for graduate school at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is what brought me here to Providence. And there I departed completely from making functional pottery, at least for a period of a few years.
At least for some time.
Yes.
And kind of gotten back into that just
Yes.
a bit.
Yes.
But not totally.
Right.
So, and what you've done, your current show is at World's Fair Gallery. So hi Willa, our friend. Willa runs World's Fair Gallery. So quite the collaboration. You're using some clay, but then also jars and pickling.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your current show.
Yes, so the current show is an installation of a variety of pickled vegetables arrayed in a spectrum of color. I believe there are 225 jars in the current show.
Wow.
And presented opposite them is a series of clay tablets that record the minutia of labor and the details of the labor involved in the making of the show, in the making of the pickle spectrum, to be precise. And I use the pickles as a means of talking about labor, and it certainly references my own background in that my female relatives back home in Virginia did a lot of canning when I was growing up. And I'm interested in it as a way to talk about process. You know, it's certainly at one time, it was a very necessary endeavor, you know, that families would engage in order to preserve their own food. And I think it is something that even to date, when we see it, I think it does speak to the amount of labor and time invested in sustaining ourselves. And so I think that it's a way for me of highlighting the labor, the incidental labor that goes into so many of the things that we consume, that we don't necessarily think about on a daily basis. You know, what it took to make this sweater, all of the tiny steps that go into the production of everything that we partake of and use in our lives.
And it's so interesting when you talk about this, because there's so much more than just the art form itself. You are going into the thought process behind it. And in the tablets, how do you transcribe the labor-intensive process? I mean, how does that, what is that, and what goes into that?
So for those, I wasn't quite sure. You know, when I started this particular show, I knew that I wanted to find some device or mechanism for recording these different little facts, like how many dishes I washed in the course of the project, or how many trips to the store and the market I had to make. And so I was keeping notes throughout of all of those quantities, but it wasn't actually until the 11th hour that I really hit upon the idea for how I would record that and communicate it. And I was, in the course of research, I started thinking about, of course, clay, and the fact that the first writing was done on clay tablets. And in my research, I learned that they were actually first used for accounting purposes and bookkeeping purposes.
They just kind of went hand in hand.
It made a lot of sense. And then furthermore, I discovered that the earliest records of pickling also roughly correspond to the time that those tablets were being used.
That's amazing.
So it seemed like a natural fit. So they are indeed they reference, without trying to be ancient clay tablets, they definitely reference them as a means of just tracking and recording.
Oh, so what was it like for you to be able to bring this into full light? It must have been the whole idea of it was it to be kind of a labor-intensive process, and then to be able to bring it full circle, to be able to record those, and then to put it into an actual show. I mean, the vivid colors of the pickling is beautiful, and then you kind of contrast it with the clay, and it kind of showcases how the two go hand in hand. And it was such a labor-intensive process, and you wanted people to pick up on that, but only if they were able to kind of make that realization themselves, right?
Well, I'm really interested and excited about making work that can be approached from many different viewpoints and at many different levels, and I think that for some people, if they walk away with an experience of this beautiful wall of pickles as like a purely sort of exciting aesthetic experience, I am excited about that. And if they are interested in learning more about my thinking behind it and the concept of labor, I am of course excited about that as well. But it's really important to me to make work that is accessible from many different angles and many different perspectives, and that is layered in that way.
Oh my
That
goodness.
has more to tell if you're willing to dive in.
If you're willing to dive in. And so my follow-up question on that was, when you look at this as a whole and just hearing what you have to say, when we were kind of going back and forth on your thought process behind this and kind of like going through the layers, is that this can evoke so many emotions. It can evoke happiness and joy and also sadness and so many layers, but it could also invoke anger and rage and so many deep emotions on so many levels. What were kind of your thoughts and feelings as you were creating this art, and what are you kind of hoping touches people on different levels?
Well, I think, as I said, I think the big takeaway for me is this a desire to seed, if at its most sort of in its most simplified form, a greater awareness of the things that we consume and the human energy and labor behind that, or those things, whatever they are. And so I think for me that's the essential take home that I'm hoping for, and also. Yeah, I think that I think I can't be too attached at the same time. Something important that I've learned in the process of making work over the last few years is that my hope and my intention for what I'm making, it exists and it's real. And once I release the work into the world, how it's received and how people come to it is totally up to them. And it is really, as much of my work is an exercise in non-attachment and in letting go of those expectations.
Okay, and I think that will bring us to a good point to show some of your work.
Yes.
Here, I'll hand this to you.
Yes.
I'll take the small one, that way in case it breaks. But you talked about being able to let go.
Right.
And I was like, well, I might drop this. Maybe you don't want me to hang on to it. But this is an example of a few of your pots, and you mentioned that you actually recycled materials from a piece in one of your other shows and made these.
Yes.
And I thought it was so interesting because we were chatting before, and I asked you, how are you able to let go of something as an artist? How are you able to take something from an old show and create something new? That has to be so hard to recreate. And you mentioned, well, I have to be able to detach. I mean, is that kind of a lesson for all of us? Because you have strong beliefs in being able to reuse materials, and we all kind of need to push forward to create less waste and to reuse more, right?
Yes, I mean, I feel that way. And I think for me, it's rooted in the time I spent living in Japan. There's a strong kind of cultural philosophy there, of treasuring material and resources and not wasting. It's something I certainly learned in the context of making pottery, I remember my teacher saying that, you know, that a tiny piece of clay the size of a grain of rice is just as important as a grain of rice, and that it should be valued as such. And so I think for me that really started to become a major conceptual part of my work when I was in graduate school, in the sense that I wanted to explore a wide range of ideas and concepts, and at the same time I was really struggling with this notion of making a bunch of, you know, massive objects that would be permanent and would remain on the surface of the earth for, you know, much longer than I will. And so I started at that point to make work that was, in a sense, recyclable. And clay is beautiful in that regard, in that it really can be used multiple times and simply be rehydrated often if it's not fired. And so I started playing with that aspect of it and really pushing the boundaries of what's allowable by the material in terms of utilizing each stage as it's called for and as it's necessary to a particular project. So, for example, the performance piece that these were, there was actually a clay floor that was being danced on for a conference that was happening at Brown, actually, and that was a collaboration with Shura Baryshnikov, who's an amazing local choreographer and dancer. And so I had this massive amount of clay, you know, about 1,000 pounds, I think it was, that was used for, I think, 3 different iterations of that performance, and each time it would be sort of recollected and rehydrated if needed, and then laid out again as the floor. And so, you know, being able to then, after that show run was complete, to take that clay and rehydrate it and reprocess it and then turn it into vessels, you know, for me it's kind of the full life cycle of the work and the material and what it's capable of. So
I mean, that's so absolutely fascinating to think about, to hear about. And I mean, it almost makes me think, so could your art even be more valuable from a consumer perspective? Because say you do a show and you're like, this is the only time you'll ever be able to see it, right? Because in essence, if this is the value that you hold, it's going to be destroyed but then created into something brand new. I mean, I just think that's such a cool value to hold, because see it now, because it's not going to exist in this form again. And so that's a beautiful belief or concept, I would think.
Well, and that's certainly something that has driven a lot of the subsequent projects that I've done. You know, this notion of how we value objects versus experiences. And
which is so true for our generation, like the generation that we're coming up in. A lot of people aren't buying as many things, they're purchasing experiences.
Definitely. And because it's sort of a pivoting moment, I think we're very much in a moment of figuring out how do we assign value and attribute value to something that isn't necessarily something that we will take home and own, versus something that we get to experience and that lives on in us. So for me, that's become a big part of what's driven a lot of these subsequent inquiries. Like I created this sculpture that was a set of sort of oversized porcelain dominoes, and for me that work was very much about the interactive element of them being tipped over and the moment that you can experience in this, the sound, the bone rattling sound of them, falling. And they actually are quite resilient, but in the process of that, usually one breaks each time. And at the first time I showed those, the curator later told me that people were often interested in purchasing the work until they found out that it was interactive. And it was really interesting to me, because for me, the value of the piece was not so much the objects themselves, but the experience that they were enabling.
Yeah.
And so that, for me, has certainly led to a lot of other subsequent works and explorations.
That is fascinating. I love it. I love it. Well, I hope you will come back and chat with us some more once again. I can't wait to see what if these don't last as bowls, then I can't wait to see what they will be next.
These will remain bowls.
These are remaining, but something else will come of something else, which I can't wait to see that. Kelly Ray Adams, you can check her work out. The latest show is Curing Time. It's at World Fair Gallery up on Broadway. Go take a peek at that. You can also check out her website, Kelly Ray Adams. We'll put a link on our website, Go Local Prov. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful chatting with you. I hope, again, you'll come back and talk to us more. Please, everyone, hang tight as we get ready for our next guest.